It's wonderful to see so many familiar names popping up. I feel a little bit like I'm at a Cousins Club picnic, which makes this a special pleasure to do it. For those of you who are new to our group, let me welcome you particularly. This is the 6th annual meeting of the Community of Practice on Scaling Development Outcomes. It's been a labor of love for those of us who've been involved with it for all those years, and we hope those of you who are joining us for the first time will feel equally welcome. Again, by way of background for those of you who are just joining, this community of practice is as close to a pure community of practice as I've ever been associated with. It's completely voluntary, it's completely free of charge, it's only as good as the members, it only does what the members want it to do. That now means you, whether you know it or not. And so whether you want to consider yourself a part of this community, we can now consider you part of this community, and we invite your participation. Nobody's a spectator in this, everybody's a participant. And so please take advantage of that. John and I have structured this to try to take full advantage of that, but it really depends on your leaning forward into the opportunity. This particular working group is one of 9. And the community of practice is now up over 1,000 members, which is, to me, quite amazing since we started as a handful. And the 9 working groups each do webinars during the course of the year. The overall community of practice does this one annual meeting, which in normal times would have been face-to-face. But I have to admit, the last couple of years doing it virtually has made some things possible that weren't possible face-to-face, which includes participation from a lot more people from the Global South. And for that, I'm very grateful. So I think even when we can return to more normal situations, we will try our best to keep some of the features that we've been forced to acquire during this COVID time. I'm going to ask my colleagues to put in the chat box information on the community of practice, which is how you'd contact us if you haven't already. Where the website is, for those of you who are in the Twitter world, how you can most easily tweet about the things that we're talking about. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out with those. Besides the annual meeting and the meetings of the working groups, we do a newsletter that comes out every quarter. That too, like almost everything else, is dependent on contributions from all of you. So we go out with a call for information before each newsletter and invite you to submit the work that you're doing that you think might be of interest to others. And again, for those of you who haven't taken advantage of that before, we sincerely hope you will. I'll say just one more word about today's session, based in part on the experience of the previous 9 sessions this time. I think maybe because we're all getting more comfortable in this virtual world, the use of the chat box has been way, way, way better this time than it has been ever before. People have been putting things there, but also people have been responding in meaningful sorts of ways. We hope you're going to do that. In fact, we're kind of counting on you to do that. We're presenting, in this case, it's not a panel discussion. John and I are going to present the work that our working group has been doing on a particular issue that we think is of widespread interest. We've got several people lined up to be respondents on that, 3 in particular, and I'll say more about that in a second. But really, we'd like to treat all of you as respondents on that. And so as you're listening to the people who we've asked to speak to the issue, we hope you'll be interrogating yourself on this and putting into the chat box anything that still puzzles you or anything you think you can contribute on the issue. And if we can't deal with those things today in this session, we're committed to trying to stick with this issue till we've squeezed it as hard as we can. A little bit of logistics. If you're not speaking, please do stay off camera and muted. If you are and you want to make a comment verbally, we'll try to accommodate those. Raise your hand with the raise hand function. Otherwise, I'll be watching the chat box for things that people put there and doing my best to bring those forward into the conversation. All right, let me now just say a little bit more substantively about this working group and about the issues we've discussed. If you could cut to the next slide, one more. So the first thing that we concerned ourselves with was trying to get our hands around what the M&E issues are in scaling. And it really helped us when we settled on a framework for thinking about that. And that framework is defined by the 3 tiers you see on the slide. Tier 1, to our mind, deals with proof of concept. And there are a whole series of things that have to do with articulating the model, evaluability assessment, pilot testing, You know this drill. And in our assessment as a working group, our community and the community at large is doing fairly well at this. Not that the further progress isn't possible, but really, if you were saying where are we doing best, we're doing best in Tier 1. Tier 2 is all the kinds of analytics that would help people go from an initial pilot to something that's scale ready or scale evaluated. And that to us has to do with refinement, streamlining, and scalability assessment. These are, we perhaps coined the term second stage pilots, which is it worked here, but will it work there? It worked under these conditions, will it work under those conditions? It worked with these people implementing, will it work with those people implementing? That's what we mean by second stage pilots. And it's another way of looking at robustness as part of scalability assessment. Also in this category are things that deal with cost efficiency, whether they're preferable alternatives. And in our estimation, our community and the community at large is not nearly as good at this kind of M&E as it is at proof of concept. Tier 3 has to do with the actual change management. That has to do with fidelity in some cases. It certainly has to do with institutionalization, which is our topic of the day today. It has to do with issues of validation of efficiency at scale, but it also has to do with continuous improvement, what some of us call adaptive management. And in our opinion, that's the place we're worst. So as a community, we decided we'd focus on tiers 2 and 3, not assuming tier 1 is handled, but that it needs less attention than tiers 2 and 3. Next slide. So in doing that, we've tried to identify a series of issues and deal with them one at a time. First one we picked was scalability assessment. And I think it's fair to say we've settled in, everyone has their own variation on this, but we've settled into a fairly now accepted notion of how to do scalability assessment. For those of you who are newer to our community and want to reach back, we're happy to share what we came up with in that regard, but I think we did quite a good job on scalability assessment. The second issue we looked at was budget guidelines, and that's because we felt that particularly in pilot projects, donors were hugely underinvesting in information, given that the basic purpose of a pilot project is to learn something that can be used on a wider scale basis. If you say the typical norm is 3 to 5% that goes into M&E, we agreed as a community of practice, the rule of thumb should be 20% in pilot projects. The third thing is we looked at RCTs, a controversial issue about where they fit in the scaling discussion. I wouldn't say we came to a consensus on this, but we really looked deep at how to use them to best advantage as part of scaling. Then we did a deep dive on the issue of case studies, since so much of the experience about scaling is case specific, and we looked methodologically as how you can extract from cases things that can be used more generally. We went on to looking at dashboards, because that seemed to be particularly important for tier 3 work, and how can we make the most out of dashboards. We borrowed from Brookings this idea of real-time scaling labs as a device for learning and tried to interrogate that. We talked not as much as we can and should about the issue of adaptive management. And finally, today's subject, institutionalization, which we decided about a year ago to take a deep dive into. Let me just say finally, before I hand over, some things about institutionalization. Next slide. So we thought it was helpful, we thought as a community it was helpful to have some kind of a tool that we could use for tracking institutionalization. And fortunately, various sectors in various ways had been working with this. ExpandNet had been working with this, and we'll hear a little bit more from Ruth Simmons in a little bit about this. Brookings had been working with this. You'll hear a little bit more from Jenny Perlman Robinson about that. We tried to back up and make that analysis somewhat more generic. And so what you'll see in this, and if those of you who want to know more, we're happy to share more, is our current version of this. And it basically says there are 5 themes or 5 areas to look at institutionalization: governance, planning, budgeting, and finance, human resources, infrastructure and materials, accountability and learning. And you can further subdivide those into the 11 items that you see in the second column. All of these programs and tools that I'm describing are essentially maturity models. So they look at the stage of development of each of those with the notion that full institutionalization is all the way over at 4, and you can track progress towards institutionalization as it moves from 1 to 4. Next slide. Just to give you a feel of that, those cells are not blank cells on the framework. They're actually filled in. This is an example of 2 of those categories, the planning, budgeting, and finance, and the human resources one, and what it looks like to move across the maturity spectrum. And so this is not science in the sense that it's very difficult to have an absolutely unequivocal determination. We see this much more as a self-administered tool that people can use to track where they are, but also to give themselves a bit of a program for where they need to go next. That's been the starting point for the discussions about scaling and about institutionalization that this working group has had over the last several months. John's going to tell you more about that. But before he does that, I'm going to invite Jenny Perlman Robinson to say a bit about this, specifically from the perspective of the education working group, since A, they've dug deep on this, and B, that was the subject of their discussion in yesterday's community of practice meeting. Jenny?
Great, thanks so much, Larry and John, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I just want to start off by really giving a huge thanks to Larry and John for tackling this issue and really facilitating greater learning and exchange on a topic that we all know is important, and yet we also know we know certainly much less about when it comes to this question of monitoring and tracking in that tier 2, but certainly that tier 3 of scaling, and really thinking about how do we monitor and track some of those more intangibles of the scaling process that are much longer term, whether it be issues around strengthened capacity, change in norms, adoption of a scaling mindset, etc. So just, huge thanks to you both for your leadership on this topic. So as Larry said, as one of the co-chairs of the Education Working Group, we've had the pleasure as a working group to engage with this issue as well. And most recently in a session that we held yesterday on this issue of really discussing some of the lessons from some implementing partners of initiatives that originated outside of the government and what that journey and process looked like to get it further integrated and embedded into a formal education system. And delighted to see that we have some of our Education Working Group colleagues joining us today. So I certainly won't try to recap what we talked about. It was a fantastic panel and conversation. But I just thought I'd share just a few key takeaways from the conversation that might link with today's discussion. So the first I would say is, while we focus a lot on government role in institutionalization, especially in terms of education, as government's role as a primary responsibility duty bearer of the right to education for all, I think what came out very strong in the conversation that perhaps the linchpin to institutionalization is really engagement with local communities and really how much an initiative is embedded within and owned by communities plays a critical role in institutionalization in a formal education system, and certainly around questions of sustainability, given changes in leadership, given changes in priorities. So for example, we heard about teaching at the right level in India and the experience in some states in India and Bihar in particular, and how it really seen and owned by the local community has enabled it to remain even when government priorities or support has shifted over time. I'd say secondly, we talked about the fact that institutionalization doesn't necessarily mean that an entire initiative or project needs to be embedded into the formal system fully. In other words, it might be particular aspects or elements of an initiative that respond to critical needs or gaps in the system. And certainly that was some of the learning that came out of the Learning at Scale research led by RTI. Thirdly, there was a conversation about those aspects that might be easiest to embed or integrate into the formal system are those that most closely resemble the system, perhaps not very surprisingly. That elements that tend to be sustained were those that really built off something that already existed in the system, as opposed to introducing something completely new. So for example, a curriculum reform where there's a process already in place might see greater greater likelihood of integration rather than a more dramatic overhaul to the system where either new processes or structures or changes in norms are required. Fourth, we talked about the evolving role of the originating organization, the organization that might have, say, created or piloted or initiated the education program or policy or approach. And the fact that for the originating organization, there's not this moment of sort of clear handover to the government and sort of a declaration of sort of, mission complete, but it really is this ongoing evolution and perhaps new roles and new focused areas for that originating organization. Perhaps around ongoing monitoring and evaluation, perhaps playing some sort of research and development role, et cetera. And part of planning for this shift really from the beginning and thinking about that evolving role requires that originating entity to really think about letting go of complete fidelity to the model. We heard about Alan Simsim in Jordan and how important it's been in working with the Ministry of Education there in integrating quality early childhood education materials to ensure that it's really the Ministry of Education's logo on all the materials, so that when new content is shared with teachers, it's really seen as part of the complete package provided by the ministry. And fifth, we talked about the long-term nature of institutionalization. A number of speakers yesterday highlighted that this is not only a long-term process, people talked about on average 15 to 20 years, but all the cases we discussed really demonstrated how it's not a linear process either, that there's moments of expansion in scope and also contraction. And again, I think some of the challenges that entails when it comes to monitoring and tracking. And finally, as Larry alluded to, we had the opportunity to share resources, and in particular, a resource that was developed to help track and monitor the institutionalization process specific to education. And this is in the form of what is referred to as an institutional tracker that was developed based on the version that Larry just shared that was created for maternal and child health and nutrition. And it was adapted to education. So similar to what Larry showed, it's really meant to be not only a tool to sort of track that process of institutionalization, but really to be used also as a planning device to say, okay, where are we seeing greater movement and progress over time in embedding aspects of an initiative across an education system, and where might areas require further attention or support? It's similarly broken down, follows similarly the same structure around core education building blocks, and then looks at specific elements such as personnel, retention and recruitment, looking at policy and planning, data management, curriculum and standards, and so forth. And similarly has a set of criteria in order to assign between low institutionalization and then across the spectrum to high institutionalization. So Larry, that's sort of, I think, some of the highlights that came out of a very rich conversation yesterday, and really looking forward to how that might relate to the conversation that we have today.
That's great, Jenny. Thank you so much for doing that and for reprising it for those of us who weren't there yesterday. John, I'm going to bring you in right now. For those of you who don't know John Floretta from JPAL is co-chairs with me the Monitoring and Evaluation Working Group. He's going to be taking you through some of what we've extracted from the 4 previous webinars we've had on this subject. But again, this is by way of inviting not just your edification, but your input on this. So please do engage now and continuously on the issue of what this all means, where you think it needs more work, and what you think possibly you could bring to the conversation. John?
Great, thanks so much, Larry, and thanks, Jenny. So I'm going to try to cover in about 15 minutes the work from the perspectives, I guess, from 4 sessions that the M&E group was involved with this year. And you're going to hear a lot of the similar themes that what Jenny just shared, these kind of 5 takeaways from the education working group yesterday. Then we're going to pass over to Ruth Simmons, who's going to share her perspective on institutionalization from her work on ExpandNet. And then we also wanted to bring, so Jenny, Larry, Ruth, and I have been members of this community of practice for a number of years, and we wanted to bring kind of an outside perspective. And so we're super fortunate to have Ben Piper with us, who we'll introduce shortly, to kind of who's been working deeply on issues of scale and institutionalization to share his perspective as well. So in these sessions that we ran in this year, the first two kind of focused on the role of what Jenny called originating organizations. We'll all use the term intermediary organizations, organizations that are supporting a government to scale and sustain and to build an innovation into their systems. And so we were very, very fortunate to have Noam and Motsepi from Young Love, Megan from Educate, Emily from Living Goods, and Nan Chen from Last Mile Health. And Noam was talking about, and Motsepi were talking about the scale of a remedial education program in Botswana. Megan was speaking about the scale of an entrepreneurship program in secondary schools in Rwanda. And Emily and Nan were both talking about their work in community health workers in a few African countries. We also wanted to bring in the perspectives of donors. And so we had Joe from GPE, Angela from Financing Alliance for Health, which isn't really a donor, but it's like a platform organization that works with governments on financing. Rachel Hinton from FCDO, and Varia Liposek from Co-Impact. And as a donor, sharing their perspectives on what they've learned from partnering with not only with governments, but with these largely civil society organizations that are playing this intermediary role to promote institutionalization. And we wanted to bring in perspective from government. We were somewhat half successful in that. We had Rajni Ved, who was fantastic, who is the former executive director of the Indian National Health Systems Resource Center, which is, you can also think of it as like an intermediary organization, but one that is inside the government and collaborating with the Ministry of Health to scale primary and community health programs. And then we asked Noam to kind of speak more broadly than M&E on his what he's learned from institutionalization from his perspective. And so we'd actually want to bring in a lot more government voices in next year. So I'm going to draw on 8 key themes, and basically the themes you'll see are kind of moving from measuring impact of a scaling program, and so thinking about impact, outcomes, reach and equity, efficiency and cost, fidelity to the original model, to assessing how government, that's the scale actor we've been referring to. We could have also talked about the private sector, but we were focusing on government, is actually owning and sustaining the program and making it theirs. And which to Jenny's point does involve some letting go from if it originated outside of government from the original organization. So when Joe spoke about what GPE's mission is, the Global Partnership for Education, she spoke about delivery and scale through systems. We really want to talk about in this part, the 4 systems. Larry and Jenny both referred to these frameworks to track institutionalization. And Larry made a point in one of our sessions that they tend to be broad frameworks that are meant to be contextualized. They often refer to like maturity models, and so you can see if you're going to help assess policy changes or financing changes, looking at different stages of ownership and institutionalization, and they tend to be participatory. Varia from Co-Impact, Co-Impact supports partners to help scale up programs through systems, and she's the director of ME, Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning. And one of the points that she made, which I thought was very interesting, was like they don't really use a general framework which they ask their partners to apply, but they do push them to think about like what would change look like within a system, what would be different from the perspective of the system, and focusing not only on formal changes but informal changes in terms of incentives and motivation and alignment, which I thought was fascinating. So in all of these examples, I'm going to keep referring to Last Mile Health, Living Goods, Educate, and Young Love. in all these examples, they were originally focusing on direct implementation themselves. And this is Last Mile Health's kind of theory of change from 7 years ago. And this is their theory of change, now. And it still involves components of delivery, if you see on the bottom of this, but it's delivery, through government systems, but also has these additional layers, and we're going to touch on them. And these themes, the themes I'm going to share as well, of like upskilling and helping grow the government's community health workforce and those of other partners, and then strengthening the overall health system. And I think that's definitely a change I've seen in nonprofits, especially in the last decade, where you do have a lot of nonprofits that are savvy of working through government in partnership with government. And so part of this whole, exploration that we're doing, not only is the M&E working group, but also what you heard from Jenny and what you'll hear from Ruth, is just like reflecting on their experience about what they're learning from doing this type of work, which I think there's a lot richer set of experiences to draw on than there was a few years ago. This is also from Last Mile Health, and I as we kind of look at the different domains, I think they have 21 different domains and system metrics and delivery metrics. I would just like turn your attention to the left side of the slide, which is coming up with M&E plans to look at, the light blue boxes going top to bottom, supporting systems, community health worker development, assessing support from other community-based groups. And then in the dark blue box, like looking at policies for community health worker selection, what's on their tasks, governance, logistics, funding, information management systems. So as you see, like they are tracking things that there's what's happening in the broader system, and that can be a little bit complicated. And so Nan Chen, who's the managing director who presented for health system strengthening, said, like at Last Mile Health, like this is kind of what sometimes in our original proposals, like we made explained that moving from service delivery to institutionalization would look like, but of course, like the reality is super messy and complex, and part of that is because there's less attribution only to Last Mile Health's work, and they're contributing to changes in a broader system, which makes things complex from an M&E perspective. Going back to these 8 themes I'm going to share, so going from like assessing behavior of like a teacher or a community health worker to seeing like, is their behavior in a classroom or in a village changing based upon this innovation that they're scaling. Now that's part of it, but a lot of what we heard from these partners and also heard from our donors was there's another side to that coin. So it's not only performance and behavior, but it's like, how effective are those systems in which they're working at supporting them. And this will be no surprise to our audience that, in-service training is helpful and necessary, but certainly not sufficient. A huge focus of both Last Mile Health and Living Goods was ensuring that community health workers were themselves set up for success. That Living Goods in their new 5-year strategy, which they launched 2 weeks ago, refers to like they're digitally enabled, they're well equipped, well supervised, well compensated. So it's really like looking at the professionalization of this cadre. I've been very, very interested, and I hope maybe Ben speaks to this because in his previous role at RTI, he did a lot of great research on this. Is like, if you think about professional development of what I'm, of teachers or of nurses, community health workers, if it's not just going to be training, then how is there ongoing professional development? And I think there's this super interesting issue, which all 4 of the nonprofits that we involved discussed, which is like, what type of like coaching and supervision is provided? And going from direct service to service through government, a hard lesson at first for Last Mile Health was that when they had to like kind of get an additional layer of support between the community health worker and the supervisor, which they had to cut for financial reasons when they went to scale through government systems. Megan Mahoney from Educate talked a lot about like mobilizing the right actor to provide this coaching, and they moved from a model where that actor in the system, was coming outside the schools to try to focus on head teachers inside the school. So how this gets done inside systems, and I think it's just a super interesting and relevant issue. And a related issue is like, could digital technology help make coaching and supervising more efficient? Is that a role that intermediate organizations can help play that would be useful in institutionalization? That's certainly a huge part of the new Living Goods strategy. Now, this fourth theme is like not only supporting scale and sustainability and institutionalization of the innovation or the program, but also of data collection and review. So, with Seppi put it, like, how do you get good actionable data into the system, which can be, maybe different than some of the standard practices. This idea of moving from, external monitoring to improving government's own data collection, non-stressed, like, developing shared questions with the government, and then helping to build data systems that will answer their own questions. And then we heard from Emily, like, just super interesting experience about building, these dashboards for community health workers, making sure that they're used at different levels of the system. But she thought a lot of what people got out of it was just helping doing these regular review meetings where people at the national level, but also the local level, looked at data. And then kind of, seeing afterwards, like, would government continue to use those dashboards or not, or when would they use them? In terms of like now kind of moving to more macro changes, assessing broader systems level changes, a point that Larry made once was, there's a difference, especially when things start to scale from governments like allowing or countenancing like the scale of an innovation to really driving and owning it. And so, two examples of some of these trackers look at are our policy. To Jenny's point, like, Rwanda was reforming its entrepreneurship curriculum, and Educate played a role in helping that out. In financing, Angela Gachanga made but I thought it was like a really interesting point of like, you can look at budget lines in a maturity model, but like that's not undervalue in-kind contributions, which is like having a focal point, it's people's time. And then you can think about, is there a budget line to fund this innovation? Is it actually funded? Does it increase? So these are some of the issues that Financing Alliance for Health looks at in particular. We all know, for all of us who have done this work, that scaling is much of an art, but also like a political exercise as it is a technical one, especially when you're building towards national scale. And it's kind of an obvious point, but I don't want to lose it, that like taking account policy and politics as well as policy is very, very relevant. And Living Goods spoke about their decision to invest more in Burkina Faso, where there is political will. I really like Jenny making this point as well, is that let's not only look at the enabling environment of like politics and government, but also broader civil society or communities and media, and helping to build a movement for change. I mean, I think that's what we've heard from Noam, we've heard from other leaders, that it's like there's a movement for making sure that every kid can read by the time they finish primary school, that it kind of extends beyond the bureaucracy. Like, that's going to help things stick. And then also kind of not ignoring the international community, outside the country as well. Living Goods sits on like WHO groups for community health worker financing. Young Love's been active in helping to inform global donor priorities through evidence. It's something that Ben has worked on as well. The seventh theme that look like that's Rachel Hinton made this point, that that's not only look at whether policies are on the books, but whether they're being implemented in practice, and there's often a huge gap there. And some ideas of additional signals that you could look for to think about whether government is, how committed government is. So one is like, are they measuring it through their own are they measuring some of these changes? So like in Educate's model, like these transversal skills, are they covered in the national exam? So there's a policy that they should be covered in the curriculum. Are they measured in the national exam? And then that helps to align incentives. Champions at different level of the systems that are advocating internally and externally for this program. And Noam always makes this great point together with Motsepi about motivation and energy of teachers. Are they seeing the change? Do they believe in the program? That's also a big sign that there is will for implementation. But coming back to the beginning, like Deng Xiaoping had a quote something like it. Looking at economic systems, it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. And we could have a beautifully institutionalized program that doesn't deliver results or doesn't isn't reaching the right people. And I think like coming back that's ultimately when we look at institutionalization the most important thing. And this is a picture from Young Love's annual report. Two themes I'll call out really quickly before wrapping up. Every single person that we spoke that spoke across these 4 panels spoke about non-linearity. Sometimes things go quicker and slower. There's always steps back. And let us with this quote of institutionalization goes up and down, but as long as the trend line goes up, we're in business. And then I'm again super interested in this learning more about intermediary organizations and how they find opportunities, how they build relationships, what makes them successful, and maybe even looking more like at the experience of successful intermediary organizations and what more about what they're learning. So again, like another point that they all had in common is that they still do some direct service delivery. It's not the bulk of what they're doing, but they kind of see that as essential for pushing the model and for R&D. They have capabilities, to work at the community levels, but also to be effective in the capital to kind of influence these larger changes that are helpful for institutionalization. I think maybe a major commonality across all 4 is not only are they good at building coalitions with government, which can be very, very complex, having access, building trust, building close relationships, but also building coalitions with like donors and civil society and researchers. And I kind of, I've really seen a few organizations do is sometimes like, NGOs, just like donors, we talk about donor harmonization and kind of focusing on programs in countries. In some cases, you're seeing civil society, like in the case of Living Goods and Last Mile Health, begin to coordinate and to offer like, a more combined package. And I think that's kind of inspiring and also a change. And basically, this last point is like kind of this is impossible really to do with project-specific funding. Like all these organizations have a pretty robust core funding, which allows them to be flexible and move and find opportunities. So I will stop there. And I'm very much looking forward to getting 2 more discussants on board. First, I want to start with Ruth. She is a PhD and she's a professor emerita at the Department of Health and Behavioral Health and Education at the University of Michigan. And she's a member of the ExpandNet Secretariat. And I want to invite her to talk about her role in helping, we don't have time to cover her role in helping to found and convene ExpandNet, but like ExpandNet's perspective, which is a global learning community of health and development professionals, policymakers and scholars engaged in efforts to take innovations to scale. But I'm really curious, Ruth, just about like, ExpandNet's perspective on institutionalization, and then we'll turn to Ben to give us a perspective from outside our community of practice. So Ruth, over to you.
Thank you, John. I'm very pleased to make a few comments about the expanded approach to institutionalization, which incorporates many of the points that have been discussed in the sessions during the past 2 weeks and also today. In the ExpandNet framework, institutionalization is a type of scaling up, which is also referred to as vertical scaling, which we define as the policy, political, legal, budgetary, or other systems changes needed to incorporate the innovation at the national or subnational level to ensure sustainability. The ExpandNet's approach to institutionalization is to begin with the end in mind. That is to think ahead to institutionalization when pilot projects or other innovative research are initially designed and implemented. I know this session is focused on institutionalization during the later stages of scaling, but we think a focus on institutionalization is so important early on also, that I'll begin by discussing the tool we've developed to show that one can begin with a focus on institutionalization from the outset. ExpandNet, this tool that we developed, has 12 specific recommendations for the very purpose of ensuring institutionalization. This tool is called Beginning with the End in Mind, Planning Pilot Projects and Other Programmatic Research for Successful Scaling. The first 3 recommendations are: 1, engage in a participatory process involving key stakeholders and ensure the relevance of the proposed innovation. And 3, reach consensus on expectations for scaling if the innovation succeeds. This means involving key individuals from the future implementation organization from the outside in order to seek their input in project design for the purpose of making it realistic, feasible, and relevant, so that the necessary systems changes needed for institutionalization will be made if the interventions succeed. Recommendations 4 and 5 tailor the innovation to the sociocultural and institutional settings and keep the innovation as simple as possible. In other words, innovation should be consistent with local values and institutions, and at the same time, consistent with the norms and operational culture of the implementation organizations. Moreover, it is essential to assess opportunities and constraints within the political, policy, health, or other relevant sectors that will impact future large-scale institutionalized implementation. And since one of these constraints, especially in the public sector, is that capacities are often limited, it is essential to keep the innovation as simple as possible. Recommendations 7 and 8 focus on testing the innovation in the variety of sociocultural and institutional settings where it will be scaled up and tested under the routine operating conditions and existing resource constraints of the health sector or other sectors. In other words, if the goal is to institutionalize interventions, you have to be realistic from the outset. The other 2 recommendations that are particularly relevant for future institutionalization are advocating with donors for financial support beyond the pilot stage, and prepare and advocate for necessary changes in policies, regulations, and other systems components early on as well. The importance of institutionalization is also a major part of the ExpandNet tool, 9 steps for developing a scaling up strategy, where the 5th step relates to making strategic choices to support institutionalization. We point out that the specific activities that need to be undertaken will, of course, vary according to the context, and especially to the extent to which institutionalization has already been considered all along, while the interventions were initially tested. At the end of our Beginning with the End in Mind tool is a checklist for assessing the scalability of pilot projects, which allows a quick and easy evaluation of the extent to which pilots are focusing on institutionalization. We've also developed an implementation mapping tool for documenting the process of institutionalization, as well as other things, during the process of execution and larger scale implementation. Thank you. John, over to you.
Fantastic, Ruth. I really appreciate you joining us and sharing ExpandNet's rich experience in this area. And I just sent a chat to Laura, but if you also see it, if you could share some of these tools and the links to these tools in the chat, that would be fantastic. Will be shared. We can link to them in the presentations too.
John, if I can add, of course, that all of these tools are available on the expandnet.net website.
You're perfectly coordinated with Laura, who just gave us the link to that. So thank you so much, Ruth. And so we want to bring a perspective from outside the community of practice, and there really could be honestly no better person to do this than Ben Piper. He's now the Director of Global Education for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He's based in Ethiopia. And in this role, he supports grantees focusing on improving foundational literacy and numeracy in low and middle income countries. Previously, and where I know Ben from, he was the Senior Director of Africa Education for RTI International, where he provided support to large-scale education projects across sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Dr. Piper is previously the Chief of Party for the Kenyan National Literacy Program called Tusome, the set of RCTs in Kenya called Primer, and the National Tablets Program, and he is the PI for Learning at Scale, a multi-country study of highly effective large education programs. And Ben I've had the chance to hear him present on a few times over the last few years, and I always learn something, and I'm just such a treat to be able to welcome him here. So Ben, over to you.
Thanks so much, John, and hi everybody. It's good to see names I haven't seen in a while. First of all, just a quick correction. I'm almost the
sorry, Ben.
Education at Gates, almost there, and I'm almost in Ethiopia. I'm currently in Kenya.
I figured that might be something you almost would be doing.
Still navigating that. So thankfully, we don't live on Twitter, and Twitter is not reality, because if you've tracked Twitter of late on this topic of scaling and institutionalization, there was an interesting Twitter thread yesterday called Nothing Scales, and there was a follow-up called Really Nothing Scales. And it was, both of these were a long list of pilot programs that didn't scale. So I think, even though I haven't been part of this group officially, I'm definitely a compatriot with hope that scaling is possible, and excited to hear so much from all of you presenters today, but also from the previous sessions. It sounds like are thinking about dealing with the complexity of scale. So I'm going to just talk about a few things. There's just so much that came up from today, but I'll try and be focused. So John asked me the question of, from my experience as an implementer and a researcher, how do you assess whether or not your attempt to scale up is sticking? How do you assess it? So this is my response to that question. If you want to understand whether or not your program is assessing from my point of view, it's really important to choose what matters. And maybe, again, as an external party to this community of practice, one of the things that did stick out to me is there's a lot of things in these tools. And so from my point of view, it's easier to work with government to decide how to analyze and evaluate the implementation of a program that they're implementing if the tool for assessment is simple and limited and targeted. So in the Kenya case, where we implemented this Tusome National Literacy Program, we were really focused on three main things. And even if you're not coming from the educational sector, maybe you can think about kind of the levels of the system that you are working in that are relevant for these. Number one, classroom utilization, the lowest level. Simply on a daily basis, as when I was the leader of this program, I had data every day from hundreds of classrooms that would tell us one question: the number of days the lessons are being used. This is a literacy improvement program, and the instructional time used in class. So core question: is the program being used? Classroom utilization. And if you think about some of the research we've done within RTI, there's a real range of utilization. So large-scale programs that would have been considered at scale ranged wildly with respect to this measure, from 20% of classrooms are using the materials on a consistent basis to 80% at scale. So that's the number one. And the program that I was fortunate enough to lead actually got to 80% of teachers were using 80% of the lesson. So at least within our programs, the highest implementation level. And this kind of focus is something that can actually be reinforced by the system. Then going to some of the comments about coaching and support, this is something that the government implementers, whether it's community health workers or the coaches in the education system, can reinforce the utilization of the program on a consistent basis, and having that data not just known by the program externally, but by government officers across and above the system. But it's a key point to note, kind of what I heard John say at the very end. Teachers will only do this if they themselves think the program is working. Teachers are relatively autonomous in many countries, and they're resistant to change, and particularly change that doesn't work. So you only will get 50% utilization, let alone 80 or 100% utilization, if teachers themselves are determining, using their non-scientific but really important analysis methods to determine whether or not the program is working. So this issue on a daily basis for the program, for the government, for the system, knowing across the country, across the regions, whether or not teachers are implementing. That's the number one thing we talked about, and I think was really important to have the system thinking about it themselves. The second one is really related, but it's kind of at the mid-level, is the number of visits that individual government officers were making of teachers on implementation. So this allows you to kind of have an idea where the problem spots are. It's inevitable that your scale-up program is not going to work the same level, is not going to be implemented the same level of fidelity across the country, but a system that is fully institutionalizing it will know that information and be able to respond to it quickly. So it will tell you whether or not the message about the importance of the program is being reinforced, and critically to me, tell you whether or not these individual officers, who are also autonomous in some ways, are making the micro decision to choose to support your scale-up program, government scale-up program, over the multitude of other things that they have in place. So that's the second one. The third one is at a higher level. Are they spending their own money? And the amount of money might vary at various levels of institutionalization and scale up, but fundamentally, are they scaling their own money? In the education sector, are they paying for training? Are they paying for the books? Are they using their own resources for coaching? If you're going to have a program that's institutionalized, it needs to do those things. So at the classroom level, teachers utilization; at the middle level, coaches doing visits; and at the kind of national system level, are they spending their own money? And I really am influenced by Luis Crouch and Joe DiStefano, who have a paper called The Core Functions Framework that really helps us think about these things. So that's kind of the one bucket I wanted to share first. The second bucket is about demand. And I think when I saw some of the tools, I wonder whether we're missing an analysis of demand. Are we providing a thing that people want? Or is the effort on scale up on a topic that aligns with the daily incentives of government officers who are busy firefighting with a variety of things? How much do they care about this thing? And what are the ways, going to Ruth's comment, what are the ways from the outset that we can design the program that should be and eventually will be implemented at scale to respond to the incentives and the demand concerns of individual and system officers? I remember when I first started off working in the Kenyan program, I heard about this years later, that one of the directors of policy in the system asked one of our kind of senior experts, senior leaders from Kenya, what does this Mzungu of yours want? What's the real thing that they're pushing for? And I think that's indicating that my initial attempts on these efforts were about we're providing supply of a thing rather than understanding the felt need of the system and reorienting the program to the extent possible to respond to demand. We want to help these programs solve the felt needs of government in way X through means Y. So that issue of demand is a big one. The third one, just again, hearing all of you talk, is just about the importance of the middle level civil servant. What could be more boring of a topic than the middle level civil servant? But for me, I really, when I think about some of the evidence I've seen on scale and on the tools on scale, I sometimes worry that we're missing that middle level civil servant. This is why it matters. I would argue it's kind of easy to get the letter of buy-in from the minister and the MOU. And if your program works, it's pretty easy to get a teacher to implement. I think a lot of programs struggle because of that meso level. Why does this busy middle level civil servant care at all about the program? And we might be pushing high at the top, say, yes, the speech from the minister saying we're going to do this, and teachers might implement, but I'm sure all of you who are working at scale have seen the barriers that come from the mid-level, not because of them, and I think this happens a lot when we write this stuff up, it's because they're misaligned or because their incentives are wrong. I would argue it's because of poor program design. How can our programs that are working on institutionalization connect to how the civil servants are evaluated? What do they care about? Does your program and its work inside of government, does it align with their yearly evaluation? Does it align with how their boss looks at their performance? Are there ways that government can provide positive reinforcement for implementation? And on the other hand, are there ways that negative reinforcement, accountability, another way of putting it, could be effective? And one of the things I think was really effective in the Kenyan case was just as a new minister was having his first meeting with his the county level officers at the education sector, the only data that he had about county level performance was the data from the program I was supporting, called Tusome. So he was having his initial meeting. He shared the dashboard of program implementation county by county, and in his first meeting, he made the 3 county leaders for the 3 highest performing counties stand up, and everyone clapped for them and they said good job. And then for the other 3, who were at the bottom of the distribution, he didn't make them stand up, but he did say, I would like to encourage you to implement. So the tools that we're developing, how can we align it with the desire that I think a lot of governments have to be able to hold and support their systems more effectively? I heard a lot of talk from Larry about dashboards, and it's a question of how do we kind of think about the utilization of dashboards to connect to the decision making of these middle level civil servants, both from an accountability point of view, but also from a positive reinforcement point of view. I heard a little bit about this, but I did want to just push the community practice on this issue of motivation. There's actually a new article that just came out on teacher motivation. Caitlin Barron and Anna Stepnayak just published it. It was very good about the basic point that what's the best way to improve motivation? Their data suggests that the best way to increase motivation is after teachers have shown success with the program. That it's not like you get teachers to be motivated about a theoretical idea of this institutionalization program, this new thing you're trying to do. It's after they've done their initial attempt of implementation and they feel that kids have made dramatic gains, or your community health workers have seen dramatic changes, that increases motivation. So it's a bit of a quandary, a kind of complex thing. We need them to initially try, because they'll never have the change in motivation come unless they've actually had this positive experience. But I do think it's really critical for us to think about the change process of these kind of lowest level servants, the lowest level civil servants, the teachers, but also the system. Motivation might come from success, and it has implications for how we initially get these officers to try it. In the Kenyan case, we actually made an explicit deal, so to speak, with our counterparts to teachers. This was the idea: try this thing for 3 weeks. I know you've had many people train you. I know you've had many things that are promised. Just try these for 3 weeks. If it doesn't work, forget it. And you're trying to reinforce these set of teachers, or wherever you're working with, doing the new thing. Once they see that it works, then you start getting the attitudinal, motivational change. Similarly, at the system level, being able to distinguish this new scale-up program from the dozens of other previous programs that failed. If these officers, these government officials are logical, and I promise you they are, if they're understanding the donor world, and I promise you they do, it takes a little while and a lot of change for them to distinguish this one that's going to scale successfully from the various many others in the same sector with the same promises that failed. And so what are the quick wins? What are the ways that we can start being able to show not just the teacher that the program works, but the mid-level, the government, that the program works? In the case of Kenya, the government officers saw pretty quickly it was different, because books were delivered on time, because the training actually happened by government officers, and because these teachers implemented. There was a different feeling that they got about this program. And so instead of ignoring that there's kind of a structural resistance to change because of the failure of us in our previous attempts, being able to be explicit that yes, we know that this program failed because of X or Y, and that this one, when you get some success, will start to create a motivation to implement. So John also asked me to mention briefly about this a study called Learning at Scale. It actually is really influenced by others' work. Jenny on Millions Learning and Real-Time Scaling Labs has been really something we've tracked. Learning at Scale is a study of programs that met two key criteria. Number one, they were large scale, thousands of schools or national. And number two, they had evidence of high effectiveness, rigorous study of program impact. And we'll actually be sharing the findings of what characterized these 8 successful large-scale programs next week on Tuesday with a session with Center for Global Development and Gates Foundation. And I won't get to that too much, but I'm excited about some of the things we're learning from that, about what these programs that we'll be excited to put back on Twitter and speak back to those Twitter threads that are saying that nothing ever scales. These ones did. So there's so many other things to mention. I highlighted a bunch of stuff that Jenny said, the idea of kind of designing for scale, letting go of the complete fidelity to the intervention, and about some of the things that John said about how do you move from training to coaching. It's not just about training, and then I can think about these ideas around the kind of the JDs of officers, incentives, etc. The scaling is an art. As someone who's tried to do scaling, I think my weakness as an artist has come out, the many failures, but the persistence, I think we heard that from Noam. It's the kind of the bouncing up and down, but general upward trajectory, that's been a theme. So I really just want to appreciate everyone for this. I'm excited about this Learning at Scale research is coming out. There's a lot that we've learned, I think, from what the programs that are highly successful and worked at scale have done. We'll be able to share that next Tuesday. And thanks, John, and everybody else, and Larry, for the opportunity to share. And I hope to be able to be part of this this community practice going forward. Thank you.
That would be absolutely fantastic, Ben. We would love to welcome you back as a speaker and as a participant. And I, again, as always, learned a lot from what you shared with us. If you were able to stay just for a few more minutes, I know that you're going to have to leave within the next 5-10 minutes or so. But Larry, I'll turn over to you. Is there any questions that you'd like to Jenny had to leave, but to maybe address first to Ben and then maybe to Ruth, or if he could handle some.
Well, there were some really stimulating questions that appeared in the chat box. I'm going to voice 3 or 4 of them, and Ben, just pick the one that you like best to respond to. There was one I thought a very provocative question about mindset, and particularly mindset on the part of the people who originate the intervention. At some point in the successful interventions, there's a shift in perspective. Maybe they saw it at the beginning, maybe they didn't, but they realized that to get this thing institutionalized really requires them taking a step back. And are there any, and altering, maybe not walking away from it altogether, finding a different role that really is facilitative of the ongoing internalization by the government. Any reflections on that? That's question number 1. Question number 2 is a methodological question to us as a community of practice about attribution and contribution. And that we, as social scientists, we tend to live in a world of attribution, but we're talking in a different world now. We're talking in a world where people really need to collaborate. We're taking credit for things is actually dysfunctional. And how far can we back off the attribution notion without undermining our own ability to attract resources and to be accountable for the stuff that we do. And the third question I'll highlight, there were several more, but the other one I'll highlight has to do with this notion of the donor side and anything we've learned about how to get donors to do something which is neither intuitive nor incentivized for them, which is to support these internal change processes on the host country side, when it's much easier, and I don't mean to say this in a judgmental way even, but it's much easier for them to take accountability for resources when they endogenize those functions and say, look, this is what we did. We can't take responsibility or credit for what happened outside of our control. So don't try to speak to all of those, but pick one or some combination of those, and then I'll ask Ruth and John to respond as well.
Yeah, those are great, Larry. Thanks so much. I think that issue of kind of the mindset and whether it should happen, the question I heard was kind of, is it from the outset or is it somewhere in there, and what changes the mindset? What does that look like? I think we actually have done some analysis and some thinking about this issue of designing for scale, and Larry, going to your point of kind of the different tiers, and kind of designing that tier 2 sort of thing for scale, designing for the reality of government structures, that if you're doing if your program depends on coaching, you should make sure that you're using the ratios that exist in government rather than kind of this kind of idealized 5-to-1 or 10-to-1 that you'll never find in most of these countries. So that there is some part of this kind of mindset that comes from the beginning, but also in my experience here in Kenya and a couple other countries in the region where we try to do scale up, this process of when you push and when you don't push in a way that kind of allows and ensures that government is actually taking ownership while not giving up the core part of what the intervention does is really too difficult to even have written down from my point of view. But as someone who has been kind of having to go through a mindset change, it is remarkably hard to do it, but really important to not push as much as you did at the beginning as the program gets scaled. Real last quick point about the donor side. The one comment I'd made actually is that if you look at the learning at scale programs, we were studying 8, but we had looked at dozens and dozens, 150 initially, and took seriously 50. And there's a pretty small range of donors whose programs were included. So there are a lot of the large education donors that didn't have a single program that was even close to inclusion because either they didn't have rigorous evidence or they didn't have a lot of things at scale. So donors who are trying to talk about and be consistently concerned about this issue of program impact at scale need to maybe rethink whether or not their programs are working. That isn't quite your question, but I wanted to throw that in there. Thanks, Larry.
I actually like your answer better than my question. You know, if I could toss in an editorial comment before I hand over to Ruth for a comment. I think if I had to pick one metric to look at or one clothesline indicator for how intermediaries are changing or how initial implementers are changing, it would be the way the branding looks. Because somewhere along the line, something has to move from being a scaled intervention to simply being the new normal. At that point, it doesn't belong anymore to whoever it was who originated it, and to the extent it's identified as such, it's probably not being scaled in the way you wish it were. I know you need to go. Thank you for hanging with us, and it was really super useful. Good luck out there.
Thanks so much.
Ruth, let me ask you same 3 questions. Just pick as you would from among them.
Trying to get myself on. Okay, I just have sort of 3 themes in answer to your question. And the first one, in our role as intermediary, I think it's very critical if we do want to succeed with our counterparts in the system, and particularly also at the middle level, help them succeed. It's very important for us to listen. Listen to their perspective. Seek to understand it rather than being critical. Listen, seek to understand, and then, based on that understanding, facilitate the process. Those are my 3 key points. Other questions?
Well, I'll ask you one more, because I know you've had experience with it, both positive and negative. Do you have a view on this notion about working with donors? And I'll ask particularly about if you've had any observations about the official donors that are accountable to taxpayers and so on versus foundations on this. I didn't prep you on this question, but I'm really interested in your point of view about that. Do you think that there's a particular role that, for example, the less constrained donors can play in trying to help with this transition?
Well, I would like to focus on the foundation donors, because in many ways, actually I can focus on both, but in terms of the foundation owners, ExpandNet has really had extraordinary experience with support from the Gates Foundation and individuals within the Gates Foundation who really also seek to understand what is happening in the process of implementation and institutionalization, and facilitate and allowed us as intermediaries to help them understand how together we can play that role of facilitators. In terms of official donors earlier on from USAID, I've also seen extraordinary examples of people who really seek to understand and support and push forward the scaling up process, which was particularly instrumental when I worked in Bangladesh earlier on, where a key individual from USAID really made it possible that this extraordinary success in the family planning project and MATLAB in the rural areas, which nobody had anticipated. Everybody had said, this cannot succeed. And then when MATLAB showed that this can succeed, the donor was very influential in supporting a project which then was a proof of implementation within the government system, and showed to the government that what was succeeding in this research station could also succeed within the government program. And the donor then really facilitated this, and government used this proof of implementation project, the extension project in several government districts, almost as a scaling lab, where they learned how things that were done in the extension project could succeed more broadly. And they recruited, as a result of this, 12,000 additional community health workers.
Well, I can say, speaking on behalf of the community of practice, and we'll talk about this at the final plenary next week, but we really want to dig down on this issue of mainstreaming a scaling mindset within donor agencies, and what that requires operationally as well as attitudinally in order to do it, and what you've just given is an example of exactly the kind of conversation I hope we'll have. John, let me turn to you initially for responses on any of the questions I raised. Thanks, Ruth.
Yeah, thanks. And just thanks to so many people who have made comments and questions in the chat, and who are engaging with the thumbs up. And I really appreciate it. It's very nice to see. I don't think I have a very good answer, but a question that Abe Grindle asked, which I think kind of gets at some of the issues that I've been thinking about, at least, has been, he says, are you seeing differences between efforts that are trying to add something new to a system? So, for example, like a new community health worker program that when one didn't exist before, or working with the government to change or improve what they're already doing, like changing a school pedagogy or curriculum. And I think it goes back to the point that Jenny made, that like at some level, kind of the programs that are not only our priorities, but like where I think the implementation is not something completely new, was a theme that came out of that working group of what tends to stick. As Abe would know this example, we were, as JPAL, working with Pratham on teaching at the right level work in Zambia. And I don't think that we would have had an opportunity to work on that program or to share global knowledge that Zambia could draw from if Zambia also wasn't like already focused on trying to design a new remedial education program. Like, we just caught them at a great time when that was on their radar and is what they were thinking about. But I think like Ben's Tusome example from Kenya is even like in many ways it's kind of a very powerful example, because where we collaborate with the government and kind of started off in 80 schools and then moved to 1,500, and now we're working through Teaching at the Right Level Africa, towards national scale. What's really interesting about the Tusome program that Kenya, that RTI did, that helped with the government of Kenya, it was funded by USAID and FCDO, or DFID at the time, was that it was like a massive curriculum reform. And so actually what was kind of brought to the system was new books and kind of in some ways new standards. And so it was almost like a more ambitious type of reform that was like set for national scale at the beginning. And so like it's really, I think there's this kind of related point of like going bottom up and top down, and how new is your, and in that case, you know, the government was going to have a national curriculum, so it was going to implement it. So in terms of like whether, you know, there would be follow through, I think that's like maybe so big that that there would be. But I think that question is really very, very interesting and worth discussing more. Well, but that's all from me, Larry.
I'm going to reluctantly bring this part of the conversation to a close. I just want to say one thing, again, an editorial comment from myself on this particular issue, which is that we haven't talked much about the budget side of this, but in my opinion, it's absolutely central to the concept of institutionalization, not only because typically anything you're institutionalizing somehow affects the budget, more importantly, anything which is not budget neutral or cost saving to the government is facing tremendous headwinds right now in the post-COVID period, where these public budgets are terribly constrained. And a number of the things that I've seen try to scale simply have not been sufficiently attuned to what it means for the government budgetarily, and haven't worked closely enough with the government on where this would fit into not only their funding envelope, but their funding priorities on things. That's, for me, directly related to this issue of whether it's adding or not, but it takes it from a slightly different perspective, which is not the behavioral side, but the financial side of what it means to be on the side of adding as opposed to just changing. I say that only by way of saying that we as a community of practice feel like we've got a ton more to do on this issue. And I'm going to transition back to John in just a second to ask you to help us in terms of where to go from here, both on this issue and on others. But we hope that people are staying with us around this notion that this is a sufficiently important topic, this institutionalization topic, that we shouldn't let go of it until we've squeezed out of it as much as we possibly can. So to John, in my mind, we're about halfway through an important learning cycle on this. The next piece is we, the community of practice, are going to commission a paper, a thought piece on this, trying to pull together where we are to date and a few indications of where the unmet need may be for work on this. And then we're going to come back to all of you in hopes that you can help us fill this out, both with examples and with trying to populate in a thought way the pieces that haven't yet found their way to fruition. Today was a big step forward in that, as far as I'm concerned, both in consolidating what we've done and thanks to all the speakers, moving the next step beyond that. John, back to you.
Great, thanks so much, Larry. So one thing that we want to turn our attention to now, and hopefully get some feedback in the chat, and then I'll set up a Mentimeter where people can vote as well, is like what themes that we should be considering for next year, and so one of the things that as Larry said, we're definitely going to be trying to, and we'll I tried to take a stab at that today, is try to synthesize some of what we're learning across the different sessions from the M&E working group. I think bringing in insights from other working groups as well will be really important. And we're super lucky to have Susan, who is a technical advisor at Georgetown University, who will be helping to kind of pull together a working paper and thought piece that kind of more formally synthesizes these discussions. And so that's something that, as Larry said, that we definitely want to do. But we want to look too at other themes, and these are just ones that Larry and I happen to think are interesting and jotted down. And I think what we would love for feedback on the chat would be which of these themes resonate, and what other themes that are not here that we should be considering. And at least on these themes, I'll put it to a quick vote on a Mentimeter, and that'll be helpful as we do our planning for next year. So this is a little bit a comment that was inspired from a comment that Varya made, and also a comment that Rajani made from the National Health Systems Resource Center remarks in India is a little bit, and relates a little bit to some of Ruth's and Ben's comments too, is that it seems like kind of these signals of motivation, of incentives, of power are really important. And I'm kind of curious, this could be a little bit difficult to do in practice, but I'm kind of curious from a measurement perspective of maybe, crowdsourcing and highlighting different partners, whether they be, intermediary organizations in civil society or donors that are like doing innovative things to measure, to try to measure these more hard to measure signals of ownership and of institutionalization. So that was kind of one theme. And a second theme is kind of further diving into the role of intermediate organizations and maybe some analytics about what successful ones or seemingly successful ones have in common. Another theme is learning about investments in improving government data collection and analytical capabilities. So not so much, they're hiring external, M&E or, other organizations doing M&E externally, but like investments that have been done, around improving data collection. And I was inspired by learning a little bit from Emily at Living Goods about what they were doing and thinking that might be an interesting area to learn more about. I am interested maybe of this fit for purpose external M&E to measure impact of scaling models and trying to develop the frameworks for different types of study designs that can be most useful at different stages. And then Larry referenced this yesterday and had drawn from some of Jenny's comments what the education group is interested is like learning more from various efforts to support governments on costing models of scale and helping for them to lead evaluation of return on investment. So those are some themes. I'll leave them up just for now, but Larry, I won't be able to see the chat.
Well, I can tell you there've already been 3 suggestions beyond the ones that are already there great. That I think are really good ones, and I encourage people who haven't commented there to do so. In addition to giving a kind of a response to the ones we've already put out.
Oh, great. Do you want to, I'm just going to actually stop sharing my screen if that's okay. Maybe I can drop this into the chat somehow. And then, yeah, that would be nice to see. Do
you want me to say what we
could, okay. Yeah.
So there are a couple from Johannes that I think are good. First one he talks about is maybe as a group we could look at the standard evaluation approaches and criteria of the international evaluation community, and particularly the donor-funded side of that, in terms of whether they do or don't reflect the scaling dimension. I know Johannes and I have been frustrated in our effort to influence the OECD standards on this, for example. But as a community, we might not only have something interesting to say, we might actually be influential on that topic. The second point he makes is, what about writing up some of the results from the work this working group was already done? Some of the stuff that I was summarizing at the beginning, which had not occurred to me before, but I think that's a good suggestion also. Then there's a suggestion from Kate about something about measuring partnerships and the extent to which people are crowding in on issues, and how would we know that if it were happening? Then let's see if I've got any more. That's what I've got so far, in addition to the ones that you put forward.
Okay, that's super helpful, Larry. I won't try to. This will be my first Mentimeter that I'm setting up myself, so I won't add these comments yet from Johannes and Kate to our options. But what I would like to do, and I'm hoping this will be set up, is to encourage people to go to menti.com, and we'll try to wrap this session up in the next 5 to 10 minutes, because I know people have places they need to be. And let me just share my screen, and hopefully this will work. Let's see. Yeah, okay. So if people go, and hopefully, let me just make sure this is set up. If people go to www.menti.com and use the code 90835158.
Hey, John, I think we're going to run out of juice before that.
Okay.
Before that happens,
That's fine.
Let's take that down and ask people if they would to either express a preference for one of these for one or more of these in the chat box, or say you think that it's a pretty good working list, or say whatever you want to say. But we're going to come back to you more formally on this, because because there are a lot of you left on the call, but there are also people not on the call we'd like to hear from on this, and also because I don't want to rush it at the end for those of you who'd like to give this some thought. What we would like, though, is we weren't kidding when we said at the beginning that this is a community of practice in the truest sense of that word. And John and I are trying our best to not only lead it, but lead from behind a little bit, in the sense of really responding to demand on this. But that only works if you express it. And so we're hoping people, either in the form of an email to one of us or in response to a query we're going to send out subsequent to this meeting, will come back to us with your thoughts of things that you'd like to see the working group pursue further. And even better, if there's something you're able and willing to do to be part of that process. That's our perfect world, is that those of us who are the consumers are also the producers on this. So we have, I'll foreshadow a little bit the conversation Johannes and I are going to have with all of you next Tuesday in the final plenary. But we want to try to look a little bit introspectively at the community of practice in the last part of that plenary, and talk about how we're most useful to you, but also how we're most useful in general. In other words, are there things where we should be trying to influence the practice above and beyond trying to be valuable to one another on this? And it could very well be that this work that the M&E group is doing fits into that category. Places where we've either come up with standards, tools, criteria, which we really ought to take a little bit of an advocacy posture on vis-a-vis others, both host government and most especially donors on this. So any thoughts you have, please channel those to John and myself. We'll try to find a way to solicit them more formally, and we're only as good as you. So thanks so much for that. John, let me hand it back to you to close. Oh, except I want to say one more thing about next week. So the 2 sessions remaining are one on Monday, which is on social enterprise, and the one on Tuesday, which is the final of the 3 plenaries, the first 2 having been in week 1, and now at the end in week 3 will be the final plenary. And I mentioned the part about looking to the future. The other piece of that is we're trying to put forward for you what I think is a super important and interesting piece of work, consolidating the principles and the lessons we think we've learned about scaling. And so in a sense, it draws on all of what we've been saying, not only here, but previous to now. And we'd like to have a sounding board with all of you on that, as well as some notions about how to make that kind of enterprise as effective and useful externally as possible. John, back to you.
Oh, that's great. Thanks so much, Larry. So if well, we will definitely take some of these additional ideas from the chat, and our team here will share all of this so we don't lose it. I've put, again, I think Sean, thanks for sharing it. If you want to and have time to vote, I'll keep the poll open in the background, as Laura suggested, in terms of the original ideas that Larry and I shared. But yeah, I mean, what I'm really happy from is all the participation we've been getting both from presenters and also on the chat. And if there's ideas that you also have, not only for themes, but for specific sessions, organizations that we haven't reached out to that are kind of playing this intermediary or institutional role particularly well, or are very good in costing or thinking about institutionalization frameworks, we would love to feature them. And I think we've used a lot of folks who are already in Larry and I's network, and we would kind of like to reach beyond our limited networks. And so please don't hesitate to reach out, and encourage you to join the final 2 sessions next week of the Community of Practice. You can find more on the website. And just, yeah, thanks to everyone for joining us. And Larry and I will stay on for another, we can formally close now, but if folks have questions or would like to discuss anything, both Larry and I will stay on for a few minutes. But thanks for the wonderful participation, and we look forward to engaging with you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. If anyone who's still on does want to continue the conversation, feel free to take yourself off mute and to come on camera.
Hi guys, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Yeah, just to John's last comment.
Can't talk right now, sweetie.
I think CRS is playing, definitely playing a role as an intermediary organization. It's kind of like how it functions. We also have a unique way of funding our scaling initiatives, just because we have a lot of discretionary funds, which is how we have funded a lot of our initiatives. Although we have some institutional donors that have developed into being willing to fund these things, like one that comes to mind is USDA, their food for education programs, and the other that comes to mind is the, oh my gosh, blanking on the name, the Buffett Foundation. So that's one thing I wanted to mention, but I also wanted to mention that within our platforms, which Larry is very familiar with, most of them involve scaling strategies that do include, working with donors to change the way that donors are thinking about funding these things. So one key example is Platform 4, our Accelerating the End of Malaria platform, is working through Rollback Malaria to start doing more multi-sectoral malaria programming. So we have a lot of those examples. So yes, please do. Let's be in touch.
And John and Johannes, just for your benefit, it was examples like that that I was alluding to when I was saying there's a role for the philanthropic side of this that I think is really underappreciated. I mean, I really, in early years, I think the philanthropy side really had its strength in experimentation and pilots and reaching the hardest to reach communities and filling in gaps on things. But I don't think that's the case anymore. I think in many of these cases, they can really play a role because they don't have the same, in some cases, don't have the same kind of accountability and stewardship constraints on this that the official donors have in some of these system institutionalization things. And the stuff Chris is talking about is exactly in that spirit. Gates has tried to do that too. In very different ways. That was what I think Ruth was alluding to.
Larry, just to throw in here, I think another group of organizations that you might look at is actually vertical funds, because the GFs and actually what we heard yesterday from the GCF, or the day before yesterday, is a very good example of how these vertical funds are much more effective, I think, in focusing on scaling up as a mission, and then actually also implementation. And as we heard from GCF, thinking much more creatively about financing, innovative financing mechanisms than the traditional multilateral and bilateral donors, who have much greater constraints and less ability to focus sort of specific scale goals, because they have multiple. They have to have country strategies where everything has to be covered, and it's a much. So I think we need to pay more attention to these vertical funds, as you say, and perhaps to the role of the foundations, particularly the bigger foundations.
That's great. In a way, Johannes, this is a little bit inside conversation between you and me, but I'm happy to have the others listen to it. One of the problems is that we parked initially this institutionalization issue with the M&E working group because that's who took it up first. Some of the things we're talking about now are definitely institutionalization, but they're not necessarily M&E issues. So the question is, do you think as a community of practice, we should partially back this out of the M&E group and do it the way we did the other two, the principles work and the scaling and systems work, set up a little working group of the XCOM to oversee something that and not house it so specifically in this working group? Or do you think we should let this one run its course first?
I don't want to jump to conclusions here, but you guys have been doing such a good job, and frankly, it has. I think you've sort of by incubating the issue as you have in the group, I think you've given it more attention than if we were to sort of mainstream it right away into the greater discussions. I'd be careful not to jump too quickly from the working group into the mainstreaming for the overall. However, I mean, that links to another thought I had. Some of these metrics and tools that you developed, the mainstreaming tracker, the institutionalization tracker, actually could be, I think, directly adapted to mainstreaming tracker for donors.
Yeah,
and that's actually a tool.
You're
I
right.
thought maybe with some funding from GIZ might be interested in that, or Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Maybe we can get some dedicated funding precisely for that task. It's a well-defined task. I think we have excellent, sort of precursors on which we can draw. We might even think about teaming up, although one needs to be careful with IDIA because they have access to a bunch of donors who might be interested in that, and might be also a good way for diffusion. But so I think we can work on multiple tracks here, but I wouldn't lose your track too quickly here. So my advice is keep going for a bit at least, and then make the change as and when you really feel it's the right time.
But Johannes, if I may say something,
sure.
I still think what is being done in this working group is so important that can't you do both? You keep it within the group, but at the same time share what comes out of the group at periodic times. I think it's so valuable that you don't want to closet it for too long a time without others learning.
Well, I'll tell you one piece that we have committed to, and you all know it, is that piece that John talked about with Susan. Ruth knows her much better than I do, but I think she'll do a good job with this. And the idea is to take where we are now, articulate it, which John took a good running start on in presenting back today, but to articulate it and also enrich it the same way we did on the systems and on the principles work, and then to try to figure out where to go from there. But as a minimum, we wanted to consolidate what we've got in a disseminatable form.
Right, I think that will be very helpful, and I think is actually a model where I think funding and time or resources permitting, we need to be more systematic in when we have significant conclusions, like for example, your budget conclusion on monitoring evaluation. When we tried to reflect that in the principles paper, we had no place to go to say, hey, this is the conclusion. So I was listening to you, and to carry your conclusions into the broader community practice and beyond, we need to have a document that summarizes this in a credible way. So I know that takes time, resources, and maybe funding, and we'll have to figure out how to do that. But to me, that's very important, and maybe something that's also, by the way, relevant for the other working groups, that we have to start pushing ourselves and our colleagues to sort of, move beyond the just chatting and talking and osmosis to actually sharing more systematically.
Hang on one sec. I see John just sent a note that he's leaving. Bye, John. And in fact, I'm going to have to also. Yeah. Hi, Kate. It's nice to see you. I haven't seen your face in a while.
Hi, I just wanted to add on to that. This could be a perfect internal example of scaling it up and institutionalizing within the COP. Is that something incubated within one working group then graduates to the whole community? Yeah. And then I do think it's worth looking at more solid dissemination pathways to other groups, to donors, to practitioners. There's so much rich, good, wonderful knowledge within this group that I get very excited every time we have an event, but I always feel like, that should really have been applied. So more dissemination.
I have to say that was a learning for me this year. We really did change tax this year, and I'm glad we did. All right, well, let's declare a close to today. I hope people enjoyed that as much as I did. I thought that was really great.
Congratulations, excellent.
Yes,
excellent.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
I think
see you on Monday.
We're batting 10 for 10 so
10
far.
for 10. That's right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.